Now, okay, now in 1970, when you traveled to Oxford, you're the only professor, is that right, that's traveled as far as you know for an appointment at Oxford University across the Atlantic Ocean?
In his own boat.
In his own boat with a
Yes,
crew of five. The boat called the Wester Till, is
that's
that
right.
right? Andrew Metzoff, one of your former students at Harvard, actually followed you across the Atlantic and recalls that what really drove academics around you crazy was that wherever you went, you always seemed to have beautiful women in tow. He noted that it was well known that if you wanted to run into the most attractive and intellectually interesting females, you had better go find Jerry Bruner.
I think that's wonderful. I'm very flattered that they believe so.
The women have had quite a role in your life now, haven't they? Intellectual women.
Well, I was just sort of running back over the women collaborators I've had. They certainly have been real collaborators. I'm thinking of Patty Greenfield. I'm thinking of Jackie Goodnow, who's an Australian, and yeah,
And did you have followers as well?
I never thought of it that way. No,
You were just surrounded by them, either way.
I was surrounded by.
That's what he says. He also says that he recalls you riding your bicycle across campus, dreaming about big ideas. All the while, your students feared for your safety and the safety of others because the cars were driving down the wrong side of the road. And you were just going on your way, thinking of the next thing that you were going to research and study. Jose
But I was a
Linas.
very good. I mean, I rode bikes because the fact of the matter is that we lived up Coolidge Hill, which had to like, go all the way down Brattle Street to get to Harvard. So I'd take it in the morning. So if I had to go do an errand, something around the square, I'd jump on my bike and do
You were
it. Yeah,
bicycle riding intellect.
I'm a bicycle rider. Yeah,
Yes.
but that's also. I was going to say, is that a characteristic? I said, no, I'm making that up.
Jose Lanasa, one of your former students also at Oxford, credits you for rescuing him from studying animal learning, or his rats, as well, and inspiring him to study children. Jose remembers how you would escape from traditional methodological criticism and insist in the wonderful synchrony between mother and child in their early communications. You found that inspiring.
I found it absolutely I was dumbfounded. I mean, that capacity to do it like with no prior thing like that, the beginnings of language, the way, for example, eye contact. Eye contact, look at me like that, and the child would smile at the eye contact, which had made the mother smile. And then the mother would, yeah, and the child would, in return. And so it made me increasingly convinced that there was a big innate element in human togetherness that could develop from there, but it had to have that kind of start. So,
With nonverbal communication.
yeah, as the precondition for verbal communication. And yeah, and on this very day, I mean, Jean Galanter is giving a lecture in Princeton, which I'm missing. Oh, Dora, yeah.
Sorry.
Proving how right I was about the beginnings of language. So I'm very pleased with myself. But and I also saw it in my own children, and having the feeling, for Christ's sake, why don't they look at their own behavior, for God's sakes?
And you developed at Oxford, you developed a new infant psychology lab. Is that right? And wasn't it initially, or recently, it was named after you at Oxford?
Yeah, they got a building named after me too.
The building is named after you at
Yeah.
Oxford as well.
Yeah.
That's quite the feather in your cap.
Don't you think?
I think so.
I'm very, very proud of that. It's not a brand new building. What they did the typical Oxford thing. Oxford will not
Or
build a
don't
new
you
building
try to
unless they
minimize
have.
your
Good.
building.
What's that?
Don't you try to minimize your
No,
building.
I'm not minimizing, but it was typical Oxford. What they did was to take two old buildings and then they renovated them completely and put it together with a big sign in front. The Jerome Bruner
Jerome
building.
Bruner building.
Yes, I felt very proud about that.
Yes. Alison
And
Gopnik.
to which I have to say, as I walk by the thing, the typical kind of feeling, you say, who, me? What does Alison say?
Alison Gopnik, she was also another one of your graduate students.
Yeah.
One thing, you have a lot of graduate students who appreciate your mentorship still to this day. But she was also with you at Oxford, and she recalls fond memories of playing croquet. with you in your garden by the river as a little bit of the Anglophilia you and she share. She also recalls a meeting with you
And I want you to
decades.
know, I don't mean to boast, but I
No.
got to be, when you have a croquet thing in your own backyard, you get to be quite good at. You forget how good you can become in croquet. As compared, you beat the stuffings out of anyone who says, "Oh, I used to play croquet when I was a kid."
I do play croquet, and I'd beat the stuffins out of you, but that's okay.
All right, we'll have a go at
We'll
it
have a go.
sometime. You play croquet still?
I do.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Allison also recalls a meeting with you decades later back here in New York when you were in your 80s, and you explained your enthusiasm in great detail, an entirely new line of research looking into legal cognitive science.
Mm-hmm.
This is in your 80s, so this is about 16 years ago. What has kept you driven all the while, now into your 90s? What keeps you driven?
Driven is a funny word. I don't feel driven.
Inspired.
I feel lured.
Lured.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, I'll tell you, that's interesting. That brings up a question. When I first started working with Tony Amsterdam, when he wanted to get my help on these death penalty cases, I began realizing that one of the things we never look at in psychology is the normative. You don't want to say good or bad. Mm-hmm. You want to be neutral.
Yeah.
Like that. As if you can be neutral about the human condition. So I found here was the study of law, in which what you did was to take essentially human passions, things like vengeance. You say, you can't let vengeance loose. If you do, it's going to tear the society apart. So what you've got to do is to develop a technique that essentially formalizes it, puts it into a context where the parties who are in conflict can agree to let it be adjudicated, and you work up formal methods of doing so, rather than, you bitch, kind of thing like that. The defense has stated, blah, 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 like that. And plus the fact that now increasingly the law is getting away from the old business of formal trial. The number of trials has dropped, and the number of what's called alternative dispute resolution, ADR, alternative dispute resolution is coming up, where people come together to discuss what their differences are and how they might somehow settle without going before a court of law, which ends up with lawyer bills, going up like mad. And the best lawyers are the ones who are pushing for this. Partly, I think, to control the unscrupulousness of the shyster lawyers too, but never mind. Yeah. But so I got very much interested in how people somehow come to common terms on a thing like that, which is the thing that got me interested in how you move essentially from a very personalized conception of the world to thinking of the world as a communal kind of place which you've got to share and work in. And so the law has provided me with a wonderful opportunity to do that.
To do that.
Yeah, plus the fact that it's always fun to have, like, it's a little bit like finding a new author. I don't know whether you're a novel reader. Are you a novel reader?
Yeah.
When you find a new novel, say, geez, how could I ever have overlooked Mary Jones, the new novelist? I started reading the law. Very exciting, yeah.
This also relates to what Andrea Smorty had mentioned, the story that you and your former wife, Carol, had come across a town called Fiescherino in Italy, a place that you'd almost bought a home. You were thinking about buying a home. You'd seen it in a picture book. Do you remember that? And how...
Do I remember?
What happened?
Well, it didn't make a whole lot of sense, because what you'd have to do is to rent it when you're not there, or have somebody look after it. You run up bills, and I think Carol put it well. It's a much better fantasy than a fact. So we decided not to do it. Although I don't know. I mean, now I'm not going to have any teaching duties next year, the academic year following, and I'm thinking of maybe making my headquarters somewhere in Italy. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Salerno, maybe Reggio, something like that. And
Andrea said that you saw it in the book, but when you reached the village, everything was so different and unpleasant and crowded. Does that ring a bell? And he said that it was an example of deceptive reality. So it gets back to this notion of what you see in terms of what you experience. Does that ring a bell?
Yes.
Okay.
It rings everybody's bell.
He said, yeah. He said, according to this experience, you were capable of demonstrating, and you always have been, demonstrating that perception, thinking, memory, and language are acts of meaning by which the self constructs the world. So this is this evolution across time in terms of thinking, from behaviorism to social construction, and how this coming across this town in Italy, looking objectively at a book and actually experiencing it and constructing a reality once there, was one of your life-changing moments.
Good for Andrea, yes. Do you know Andrea? No, you've not met him.
No,
No. Oh, you'd love him, yeah.
I also talked to...
He's also, his wife is wonderful. I'll say,
I talked to Pim Lavelt. He recalls working with you at Harvard, but most importantly, your work with him in the 1970s on the Netherlands Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us about this work.
I should tell you about this work?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What happened there?
Well, psycholinguistics had not been much of a field. The linguists like to think of themselves as kind of mathematics, of the mathematicians of language, and look at it just that way. And I felt increasingly, all those years, to some degree under the influence of Roman Jakobson, the greatest linguist of his generation, that you had to look also at the pragmatic side of language, not only the structure of itself, but how the structure is used in communication. And so pursuing that, I mean, I got increasingly concerned with reviving the field of psycholinguistics, getting it to go beyond the kind of Chomskyan formal structure type of thing, although I greatly admire what Noam has done for linguistics too. Then became very interested also in the cultural patterning of language use, how it was used in the Italian versus the American, which is a very different kind of thing, like that. From the gestural business on, I mean, that, for example, interrupting somebody in Italian is far more offensive to the person interrupted than it is in English, because we're always interrupting each other. You interrupt in Italian, and you'll get that brings the conversation closer to a close, you know, like that. And but so what was Andrea's question about?
The Max Planck Institute for
Yeah.
Psycholinguistics,
Yeah.
but also related to that, your book, The Culture of Education.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of what you're touching on at
Yeah.
this point.
Yeah,
Reassessing the cognitive revolution
That's
in
right.
terms of taking into consideration culture.
that's right. Yeah,
Yeah.
much bringing it right to the center of things, along with the nature of mind itself. Yeah.
Another thing noted across all of these people that have known you so well for so long is that you are an excellent mentor to every graduate student that you've ever had, and especially in terms of helping them develop as individuals, not as your apostles, for example.
Yeah, I don't like apostles.
No, they really valued the fact that you valued them as individuals, becoming individual scholars with individual interests, and you were very supportive in that. Oscar Chase was one of them. He was a professor friend of yours at New York University, and he was very impressed by the care and time you continuously put into working with students on their own research. He recalls a conversation he had with you once, and you responded in terms of why you do that. Oscar, what the hell are we in the business for if we don't take care about helping students do their best work? Was your quote, your response back then.
Did I say that?
You did, yeah. That's a common theme.
I've never really been very good at keeping my mouth shut about my strong convictions.
Oscar also notes how you know or have known just about every important intellectual figure of the current and last century, and oftentimes this leads to funny moments when you seem to assume that your friends share these acquaintances with you. Such was the case when you told Oscar once, "Oh, Oscar, you know how frustrating it can be to argue with Jacques Derrida?"
Derrida. Yeah.
Derrida. And Oscar could only reply, "Actually, no." Whom do you think of these countless scholars of time has influenced you most, and why? Of all the scholars that you've interacted with in this century and the last, who most has influenced you?
What an interesting question. Well, I must say, one of them was Roman Jakobson, the great Russian linguist, professor of linguist. He was a joint professor at Harvard and MIT, and he kind of took me under his wing when I was quite a young kid on the faculty, to be sure, and introduced me to the idea of pragmatics, that is to say, the uses to which we put language rather than just the structure of language itself. And he had what our German friends call a Fingerspitzgefühl, a kind of intuitive fingertip sense of linguistic use that used to just leave me agog. My God, if I could only develop that. Mm. And so he had a very strong influence on me. And it's funny, there are going to be two Russians at the top of my lists. Mm. The other one was Alexander Romanovich Luria. Mm. He didn't teach me this, but we agreed on the fact that the thought processes and even perception have to be thought of as embedded in a larger scale behavior, that you had to take into account how you structured the task. I see you under these circumstances in your role here, and I see him in his role, both monitoring how the thing is coming through auditorially, and also doing a certain amount of listening to the content. I can see what changes in expression as he goes, and this curious subtlety of the way in which we operate. So those two influenced me, and the other person who interested me, who sort of set me on a line, which was terribly important, was my teacher at the age of 18, 19, 20, something like that, was the great William McDougall, Fellow of the Royal Society, who made me aware that you had to look at behavior as being motivated in some way and ask what is the direction in which it's being pushed. Although I rejected a lot of what he had to say on that. So they had things, and who were the people? And then there was one other person who influenced me a great deal. His picture is right over there with me, Robert Oppenheimer. And I got to know Robert Oppenheimer in a curious kind of way. It was in the days when I was going down to Washington in that period during the Cold War, something like that. When he was still the director of the Los Alamos station out in your part of the world there. And I used to go and stay, when I went down to Washington, stay with old friends of mine, Ruth and Richard Tolman. Richard Tolman was the great physicist, and Ruth was a psychologist who would work with me when I was doing some work in Washington. So I had a room there, and it was frequently the case that when I would go directly from Union Station up to their place, it was frequently the case that Robert Oppenheimer was also staying there. So Robert Oppenheimer, and also another person I met who had a very strong influence on me was Niels Bohr, the great Nobel laureate in physics. Yeah, and so we would get there, and Ruth and Richard would always be a little bit late in coming home, so we would have a cocktail together. And I want to introduce a new idea, perhaps, in an official thing like that, that one of the great ways of starting an intellectual friendship is over a cocktail. It's honestly true.
Yes. It can be a very nice muse.
Because it takes some of the some of the guardedness away,
Sure.
you know, from things.
Sure.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's in some ways. I mean, uh, somebody once said, I've forgotten who it was. It might have been my sister, that the closest times in a married couple is when they're getting dressed in the morning and when they're getting undressed to go to bed at night. That it's during those periods that they say, "Hey, darling, what in the hell happened with da-da-da?" You know,
Sure,
that kind of thing,
sure.
like that. And in some interesting way, this is a comparable kind of thing. You get together with people, not on any official occasion like teaching a seminar, but because it's the end of the day, you
Right.
just arrive and you're having a cocktail together, and you get Robert with the question like, "Hey, Jerry, what in the hell do you psychologists mean by motivation?"
Right, right.
And to which your response, in order to beg for a little bit more time, is, "What an interesting question."
You just used that.
You know?
You just used that when I asked you that question.
Yeah.